let's say 1998, how many bidders would you have at a typical New York Sotheby's auction?
Lucky.
In the room.
Oh, in a room. In the room.
No, actually, total phone bidders, absentee bidders, and people in the room.
A couple hundred.
Right.
But you might have, if you're lucky, 20 people in the room.
Right.
And
okay.
now.
That's it today. Do you know how many bidders? I think the last Phillips auction, they had 2,300 bidders.
Welcome back to the Collectability Podcast. Before we get started, I want to thank you for listening, and I have a personal favor to ask. Please push that subscribe button on the bottom right corner of the screen. This will ensure the future of this channel, so if you love all things Patek Philippe and Patek Philippe content, please push that button now, and also comment below after you watch this interview. So today we are joined by the one and only Marc Berliner, a longtime friend and extremely knowledgeable Patek Philippe collector. His insight as a collector and as a professional from the world of entertainment is not only unique, it rings true to me, and I learn something every time I speak to Marc. Marc and I do speak often, I would say easily weekly, on meandering watch industry topics, and we thought it'd be fun to share with you some of those stories and discussions today. We are here in West Hollywood, live, and I want to frame our chat in two parts. Part one, we're going to discuss how the watch community creates and consumes content, notably around all things Patek Philippe. And in part two, we're going to discuss common mistakes in the vintage and pre-owned collector's world. And this is going to be a fascinating discussion in part two. Before we begin, here's Marc's official bio. Marc is originally from South Florida and graduated from the USC School of Cinema Television with a degree in production. His career in the entertainment industry spans over 30 years, beginning at United Talent Agency in 1991 as an agent trainee. He's also held positions at Universal Television, Creative Artist Agency, Larger Than Life Productions, where he helped develop the Academy Award nominated motion picture Seabiscuit, which I very much enjoyed. He was also worked for Bryan Singer's production company, Bad Hat Harry Productions, where he was executive producer, or one of the executive producers of the independent feature film You Want to Kill Him, which was a web series for Warner Brothers entitled H+, the digital series. And he developed films such as Valkyrie, another personal favorite, X-Men First Class, I've seen that one too. That was Days of Future Past.
That's right.
And a television series that you've all heard of, such as House, and also famously Dirty Sexy Money, which are three words we've never heard on this podcast in one sentence before.
First for everything.
Following his stint at Bad Hat Harry, Marc ran Nick Jonas's production company, Image 32 Productions, something my daughters are very impressed with. And he developed the acclaimed Netflix series Dash and Lily. He's currently an independent film and TV producer working on a slate of feature film and TV projects. This is a very impressive bio. Usually we have like a watch bio, but now we have an entertainment bio here at Collectability. Marc's second career, pivoting to watches, has been that of a freelance writer for the watch and jewelry industry, having written website content and articles for a wide variety of publications and vintage watch dealer websites. In addition to his work as a freelance writer, Marc is a very well-known veteran collector. Veteran sounds old, but we'll just call you veteran collector.
Sure.
Buyer and seller of fine vintage timepieces with an emphasis, understatement, on Patek Philippe, wrist and pocket watches. Marc estimates that he has bought and sold hundreds of Patek Philippe watches, and this is wrist and pocket watches, over the past 25 years. He's attended endless NAWCC and national IWJG shows. He's frequently consulted by many dealers and fellow collectors, such as myself, for his deep knowledge and passion for all things Patek Philippe. That all said, welcome, Marc.
Thank you, John. What a flattering introduction, and I am so thrilled and honored to finally be here.
We've been discussing this.
I know.
Yes, for years.
On the Collectability Podcast, I mean...
You know, you've made it when you've gone on the Collectability Podcast.
You really have. So I feel like I finally... It all was worth it.
I am so looking forward to this conversation. We've been friends forever, seemingly since the early days of Patek Philippe, but in this case, the 1990s.
That's right.
And I'd like to kick off before we start part one. How did we first meet?
Well, Mr. Brigade 90.
Brigade 90.
Brigade 90. So back in, I'd say, 1990, 98, 99, eBay was not as active as it is today. You know, the wristwatch category had lots of, watches being posted, but there was also advertisements, boxes, ephemera, books, really interesting things that were largely ignored, right, by most people on eBay. And
back when under $10 bought you something interesting.
That's right. So I was an avid buyer of vintage advertisements, boxes, like I said, buckles, parts, dials, movements, you name it. I was buying. And then one day I started getting outbid by another eBay user named Brigade 90. And Brigade 90 was stealth and would come in at the last second.
He was a sniper.
Still is.
Yeah.
He was a killer. And so one day after losing yet another treasure, I decided to message Brigade 90. And I think back then that was when eBay even gave you like all the contact info.
And bidding history.
Right, everything. Yeah,
That's
there was
great.
no privacy whatsoever. And I said something to the effect of, maybe we should talk. And so John, called up and introduced himself. And then,
And I think you asked, why do you call yourself Brigade 90 if you're bidding on all this Patek stuff?
And I remember what was your answer? It was just because
it was my first email address on AOL. It was Brigade 90, and I still have it to this day.
I had the same thing with my handle. So anyway, so we started talking, became friends. Then we met, I think, when you came to L.A.
Yes.
For the Patek one of the first Patek exhibitions, I believe, right?
Yeah, that was a big one. I recall that. Yes.
Yeah, that was at the Beverly Wilshire.
The Wilshire, yes.
Yeah, so taking people back a little bit, back in that time period, a lot of collectors and dealers were on the older side, would you say? We were in our, early 30s.
Yeah, it's like 25 years
ago.
Right,
so we were in our early 30s, and we were easily, whenever we'd go to a watch show or, anywhere, we would be the youngest guys in the room. So I was expecting to see.
I miss those days.
I was expecting to see an older. I was expecting to meet an older gentleman, not a guy my own age. But anyway, so John was working at Patek, and he had just written his fantastic book, Patek Philippe in America, which was your book about Patek's advertising and the history of their advertising, and I went nuts when I read the book. It was fantastic.
And you saw the ads that I
all the ads
beat
that
you on eBay.
At, yes, exactly. Which I all hope to someday reacquire. I just, was so impressed with his depth of knowledge, his passion for all things Patek Philippe, and so we became friends and have been great friends ever since. We've, bought and sell watches between each other, with each other. We've met at shows. We've done all of that. So anyway, John's family, love him.
Absolutely.
Great guy.
Thank you, Mark. And I treasure the conversation. I say weekly. Some days I'll just pick up the phone and be like, Mark, what do you think of this? Because if there's a quirky watch with incredible provenance, you're the person I want to talk to about it. You have an incredible feel for the values of these. And you also kind of know where all the watches are. It's quite impressive.
We both know where the skeletons are buried.
Yes. And today we're going to discuss something that's a topic that's near and dear to both of our hearts, and that's how the watch world consumes and creates information. And this is a hot topic. I was trying to think of what I wanted to discuss with you for this the part one of the podcast, and I think watch content as it relates to Patek Philippe is a very interesting question, because going back to the, as my kids say, like way back in the 1900s,
right?
Which in their mind, it might as well be So, but it was the 1900s back in the 1990s.
Right.
That's what we're going to start talking about today, is how did people consume watch content back in the day?
Well, again, a different world, completely different world. We we've been collecting and writing about and, pursuing Patek Philippe watches long enough to remember a time when the watch business, vintage watch business, I should say, and hobby were much smaller, fewer collectors, really truly an analog business, not a digital business at all. There wasn't any such thing as taking a picture of a watch with your camera phone, the camera on your phone, and texting it to somebody. There was literally, this is a time when people would take Polaroids of watches and send them in the mail, or they would put a watch face down
on a fax machine.
I
remember that. Can you authenticate based on this?
Yeah,
fax?
right. On a blurry fax. I mean, it was really. It bears no resemblance whatsoever to what the watch world is like today. Today, watches are very mainstream, and there are articles about watches in Vanity Fair. It's watches have developed a cool factor that I would argue didn't exist to such a large degree back then. So in terms of watch content, it was sort of a bit primitive compared to what we have today. As I said, fewer collectors, and honestly, most of the content being of an analog, type. It wasn't often very up to date. So
that's true. There are books that we were reading from way back when, in the 70s and 80s. Usually pocket watch books,
right?
That had like the Chapuis History of the Self-Winding Watch,
right?
I mean, that was like a core book that you had to read,
right? Or the De Macy and Earhart price guides were big, and there were like 2 books on Patek Philippe, right?
Yes.
So there wasn't you really had to work hard to learn and to research watches, but the advantage to that period was that you also got to see the watches in person. You had to to see a lot of watches. You had to go to a watch show. You had to go to auction previews. We didn't have like get-togethers and things like that really like we do today. So you had to go see the watches, but there was an advantage to that because you looked at hundreds and hundreds of watches, and because there was no internet and there was no everything was pretty much sold face to face in person. You got to see a lot more watches back then. I mean, you probably remember, John, going to a small NAWC watch show and seeing incredible Pateks that you would never see today, ever.
Amazing stuff.
Amazing stuff. So, and then also auction houses, just in terms of, auction houses, in my view, were probably served a much larger educational purpose back then than they do today.
And you just gave a shout out that it really matters. And you brought back memories of a pre-internet age when I used to go to Barnes & Noble and remember Borders.
Sure, of course.
This is before you look online, because even the chat rooms weren't up and running in the early to mid-'90s. And you would go straight to the antiques and collectibles section.
Yep.
And usually it'd be on the bottom shelf. There was the Earhart and De Macy price guide book, which is a big, thick book that came out once per year. And it had literally pictures that looked like faxed pictures.
They were cut out from the fax.
Yeah, and then photocopied.
And from auction catalogs.
Yes. Yeah,
and pasted on pasted on their proof pages.
And it would have these like say $5,000 to $10,000. Like
the prices
the prices were like out of thin air, but it was the best we had at that point of time. Right. And I loved seeing the new edition. I still have all those books.
Of course I do,
bookcase of them. And it's interesting to go back in time looking through those pages now 30 years ago and just seeing relative price values compared to today, and seeing watches that like we're all obsessed over today. I mean, just look at Rolex Daytonas, and then how like they were just kind of a dime a dozen back then. And even in the world of Patek Philippe, like some of the hot rectangular 990 calibers were bringing important money back then,
Right.
and almost the same money today.
Right.
So you see these disconnects in the marketplace.
Right. But then what would you see, say, a 2499 would have been 75
exactly.
to $100,000 back then.
And there were no series. It was just 24.99. All of them.
Yeah.
You want a 1518? Doesn't matter.
It's interesting because I've spoken with a few other, dealers about this, and it seems like as the prices have gone up, the forensics have become much more important, much more specific. The bar is higher now in terms of for the Grail watches, and it's not like you said, it's not like 1999 when it's like 24.99 yellow, and the dial's been washed, but it looks nice.
Yeah, it says 24.99 on it. Done.
Yeah, done. Right, exactly.
So what? Do you have a library? Do you have a watch library?
I do.
And see all these books that you collected back in the 90s. You still have to this day.
I have 95% of everything that I collected. I have given away some things over the years as gifts, but my auction catalogs I will keep to the day I die. Well, because especially catalogs from the late 80s and 1990s are almost impossible to replace these days. A lot of people have, sort of caught on to what you and I were doing back in the day, which was buying up collections of them. So we would have libraries so we could see what the watches looked like back in their initial appearance at auction. Sometimes it's very different than how they look today.
Yes.
Right.
And the movement numbers are generally there.
It's you can. They're having. I can't emphasize this enough, but having a great library is invaluable, truly.
Any magazines from that era that you read?
Well, I wrote for a short-lived publication called Watch Time, which was published for a couple of years back.
Watch Time's still around.
Is Watch Time still around?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, Watch Time was a big one, and I'm trying to remember what some of the other magazines back then.
There was the German one, Chronicles.
I never read. Yeah. I wasn't a bit. There was Watch Time was the main one, but it's interesting. Back then, these magazines were, again, going back to what I said before, the watch hobby and business was much smaller. There was a lot less money floating around. So these magazines were really underfunded, let's just say, and understaffed. So they didn't have huge budgets to hire freelance writers. Roberta Nass was like a big one back then. She wrote for all these magazines.
And I remember even those early years with Watch Time, Joe Thompson cornered that magazine. And there was a special edition with a 5110 World Time, Patek Philippe only Watch Time.
Oh,
edition,
yeah.
Which was really, I hope people have it in their collection today, a really well done publication on all things Patek Philippe.
Oh, absolutely.
And it was the first magazine that I recall in English that was about Patek Philippe collecting.
Well, these magazines couldn't afford to be all about it because they had to sell advertising. And the thing that's interesting is, as I said, they were generally understaffed, so they would oftentimes just depend on press releases from the watch companies, which they would take and sort of repurpose and turn it into an article about, the new Tag Heuer,
This is a topic we're going to
dive
into momentarily.
Fantastic.
The pay-to-play model of
that's right
the watch world.
That's right.
So this is a good pivot. In the 1990s, all of a sudden, we start seeing some of the watch forums pop up. Time Zone, most famously. Were you active on these early forums?
Not only was I active, I was actually part of the team that when WatchNet was purchased and it was merged with Time Zone, I was part of the team that was part of that effort. So, I was very active on Time Zone, WatchNet. There were a couple of them back then, but again, early days.
Yes.
And so a lot of good information, a lot of misinformation. you know, I think that back then, you know, it wasn't frowned upon for a watch dealer to be the owner of a watch forum website. But I think some of these, you know, early websites were used as vehicles just to sell, you know, watches and not really focus so much on the content. That sort of came along later. There was a writer named Walter Detz. Do you remember Walter Detz?
Yes, and I just remember his 215 coverage in particular.
Yeah, amazing. I mean,
I hope that's still on the internet. He photographed every angle of a 215 caliber.
But that was the first example of really, you know, sophisticated.
It was a deep dive forensics.
Yes, and that was the first example of somebody really doing a deep dive, and not only doing a deep dive, but also, you know, using photography in an interesting way, not just to photograph a watch, but to really photograph the individual components and show the hand finishing and, you know, the elegance of.
It was the first time I saw like the underside of a bridge on a manual caliber, and
because
he took these high-res images. It's like, wow, the finish of what only the watchmaker sees is amazing. Now everybody does. Not ever. Some people do it, but back then that was a first.
Well, Walt was a self-trained watchmaker, so he would actually, you know, disassemble the entire watch himself, and he would, you know, do these incredible macro photographs of the different components. So
what was so exciting going back now, almost 30 years ago, is the internet. There was just new content coming on constantly.
Yes.
Because there was just so many voids of information. And this is kind of evolving today. But I remember for the first time, I'm curious if you ever saw horology.net.
I did
this
not.
This is the nerdiest site. And also, I knew that I had kin spirits out there when I saw horology.net. Because what it was is a listing of every single horological publication ever written.
Wow.
And a gentleman, Fortunat Mueller-Markey, who now the NAWCC library is named after him, and now he donated the core part of his collection, almost all of it, to the New York Horological Society. So here's someone who just wanted to give academics and based in print back to the community. And he took the time to put everything in his collection digitized and online in horology.net. I probably purposely didn't share this with you because information is vital.
Well, absolutely.
Same as it is today.
Oh, absolutely. But that was pretty revolutionary.
It was ahead of the time. Yes.
I mean, it's such a shame that I'm sure a lot of information has been lost, unfortunately, to time because a lot of collectors and dealers back then just didn't really preserve information the way we do today. They didn't photograph every watch. They didn't, you know, keep every catalog, every magazine. They didn't, you know, hoard information the way we do today. And I mean, obviously, we both know from our many adventures in restoring watches, which we'll talk about as well later, even parts and dials were thrown away. And it's heartbreaking to me because I think about all the parts, straps, dials, boxes. Back then, auction catalog, that stuff was considered, you know,
junk. So sad.
It's horrible.
A lot of that has been destroyed.
Yeah. So
in I would call it the 1990s, were all these places where you were finding content and knowledge and people sharing. How much of it was commercial and how much was academic, or was it all mixed up all in one?
I think just my recollection is that 85% of it was commercial.
Okay.
I mean, when I say commercial, I mean it was created to help sell a product or sell a watch. 15% of it, I would say the more, let's say, educational content tended to be, you know, generated by like NAWCC. We both remember the Bulletin.
Of course. Still
which is Bulletin still being published.
Yes.
And the Bulletin had some truly like scholarly articles. And also the auction houses also created a lot of educational content. I mean, you've spoken before about working at Sotheby's in the early 1990s and having the library of, you know,
all the cards cut
cards
out for
every
each
watch you could
that
ever
was sold.
imagine, which,
Mhm.
I hope still exists. I think it probably does.
Wow, I'm curious if it does. So,
Hopefully, but yeah, most of it was, I would say, of a commercial,
Mhm.
commercial bent.
And of course, alongside the bulletin, you'd receive the Mart, like
Yes,
you do
of
to
course.
this day, which I think a lot of people rip open the Mart before they get into the bulletin.
Absolutely.
But it's amazing to think in this analog world where every time you'd receive your NAWCC shipment, you would have a commercial magazine and then you would have the academic
Right.
combined in one bit of plastic bag.
Right.
And you'd rip it open and you could tell a lot about someone of which they open first.
Well, I opened the Mart first.
I did too, because it's
I
first
figured-
come, first serve.
First come, first serve. In fact, just, not that I really would call it exactly content, but you probably remember that most of the big dealers of the day had literally price lists
Mm-hmm.
that they mailed to you.
Yes.
Ashland, for example, which was a
Mm-hmm.
big dealer.
Ashland Investments.
Ashland Investments in Sarasota, Florida,
Mm-hmm.
put out a color, full color magazine with maybe about 100, maybe 150 watches, and there were usually about 5 Pateks. And you would call. I live obviously here in L.A.,
Mm-hmm.
and the publication was coming from the East Coast. So by the time I would call, it was everything that was good was gone. Everything. So
Wow.
it was, like you said, first come, first serve, and there are a lot of advantages to the digital world that we live in today, but a lot of disadvantages too, because I think there was a certain I think a certain aspect of being analog that made us all sort of get to know each other on a more human level.
You'd get on a plane.
Right. I mean, I would guess you have customers you probably never met in person.
Yes. I
That you-
consider them friends. And
You consider
I
them friends and you
never
talk
met
to them, talk
yes.
to them all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but you may have never met them before. Maybe they live in other countries, or they live across the country, live in the West Coast. But back then, we all went to watch shows, and we went, to listen, the NAWC National was the biggest
Mm-hmm.
event of the year, and everybody went to that, and so that was a nice thing about not having the immediacy of digital photographs and the internet and Instagram and social media. On the other hand, it's leveled the playing field a little bit, hasn't it? So you don't have to be an insider to buy a great watch anymore.
It was truly a food chain, almost a pyramid, the way
Yeah.
it was in the past.
Oh, absolutely.
Now that's been totally blown up.
Did you feel, as a dealer, do you feel like the playing field has been leveled a little bit?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just going back into the 90s in the auction world, all the information was within the auction houses
Yeah.
and a handful of dealers.
Right.
This is where all of the big watches would end up.
Right.
You'd either sold through XYZ dealer
Right.
or through XYZ auction house.
Remember it well.
Everyone knew everything about everyone.
Right.
But a lot of those pieces went up a food chain to get to those places.
Right.
So a piece would surface from an original family.
Right.
Like I'm thinking of a reference in my head, which I can't say, but
Okay.
belonged to an important collector. And it might sell for, back then, $10,000, and then from a pawn shop. Then it would go to a local watch dealer. Then it
Right.
would go up to the food chain to one of the bigger American dealers.
Right.
Then it would go to a certain Italian dealer.
Right.
Then it might go to auction or parked with a private
Or
collector.
go to the end user.
Yes, but you'll see that walk up from back then from 10,000 to 100,000 in 3 or 4 transactions.
Right.
Where today it might be much different. People
Right.
can go direct to marketplace.
Right.
And
Exactly.
so for dealers today, it's much different business model.
Right.
So
Well, okay, just to give people just a perspective. Let's say 1998. How many bidders would you have at a typical New York Sotheby's auction
lucky.
in the room?
Oh, in a room.
Well,
room.
no, actually, total phone bidders, absentee bidders, and people in the room.
Oh, a couple hundred.
Right.
But you might have, if you're lucky, 20 people in the room.
Right.
And
okay.
now
That's it today. Do you know how many bidders? I think the last Philips auction, they had 2,300 bidders.
Amazing.
Think about that. 10 times as many people. And those aren't just casual,
Yeah, those are active
those
bidders.
are active bidders and buyers. And yet what has happened with the supply of the of great vintage watches? It's
just plummeted. Yes.
plummeted. So, after 35 years of international auctions, watches, trading privately between individuals, people parking great watches in their collections, the supply has plummeted, and yet the demand has exploded.
It's true.
So it's very interesting.
That's good.
And so with regards to content, I think what it's created is a situation where there's just a much greater demand for content, and not only greater demand for content, but content that is much more sophisticated, that is much more accurate. And also, what's interesting is back in the 1990s, because I think watches weren't culturally as popular as they are today, it was still mostly confined to, let's say, conversations about, is a watch collectible, is a watch, original, is a watch, does a watch have a cultural importance or relevance? Today, we talk about watches, as status symbols, and as watches have become in the, sort of culture, have become more hip, more relevant, more exciting,
more mainstream.
Mainstream. And so as a result, we kind of have now two types of content, right? We've got educational content, articles that are written about watches, the history, the technical aspects, the business aspects. But then we have a subset, which is what I call entertainment content. And that is a lot of the content that lives on TikTok, Instagram, Threads, and that's not necessarily content that, like what collectability does, which is incredible. I mean, the articles and the podcasts and all the stuff that you do is really, truly amazing. And I mean, it's just you devote a lot of time, resources to it, and it's, I think, a real, huge benefit to the industry and the hobby. So
we may not be entertaining, but we are educational.
We are That's right.
That could be our new motto.
Why
You'll
not?
learn something listening to these
something.
podcasts.
You won't be entertained, but you'll never see John Reardon do a fake transaction video where he negotiates and then goes, Mazal.
No, and you won't see me in a yellow Ferrari shooting down Sunset and then doing a box opening video.
You won't, right. You won't see John at Bond Street in Manhattan having dinner with other big dealers and opening up a bottle of champagne.
But you will see a Breguet overcoil and a hairspring that will just capture my heart. And these kind of things are more exciting and interesting and educational than I think a lot of the, I like how you divide it. There's educational and there's just pure entertainment. And I enjoy some of the entertainment.
I do too.
I consume it. I love it.
Me too. But we have to understand that it's kind of like reality television in a way, and
it's canned.
And there's nothing, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it per se, but I think that one thing I hope today in our conversation, I really want people to understand that what you're doing as far as these, podcasts, some of the people that you've had on this podcast are people that really, including myself, by the way, I would never put myself, say that I'm at their level, but, I've only read one interview with Davide Parmigiani in all the years I've been collecting. I've never seen interviews with people like Tanya or, Ronnie Madavi or, some of the other people that some of the other luminaries you've had on the podcast.
We've been so fortunate. And you belong on that list. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, John. You're too kind. But seriously, though, to have, thinking about when I started collecting watches, how great would it have been to have the opportunity to read an interview, from, for example, Andrews, right?
Will Andrews.
Will Andrews, incredible. That would be amazing. Or, to have read a really in-depth interview with like Darren Schnipper, or any of the great, people that worked in the auction business back in the 90s, or some of the dealers who were prominent back then who aren't with us anymore. So I think this is just a great resource, and I really
thank you for saying
appreciate you doing this.
Because education is at the heart. It supports the marketplace.
Right.
And also, we have to discuss Hodinkee. I mean, everyone's talking about Hodinkee right now. Yeah. My heart goes out to, I absolutely love what Hodinkee's done in following Ben's journey, just from when he was starting out to, to the latest acquisition. Huge congratulations.
Absolutely.
Hodinkee's brought so many new people, new blood to it. Their video production is just
outstanding.
No one's done it as well as Hodinkee's done.
Yeah.
And from
I agree.
Hodinkee Radio to their talking watches, it's content that I love to consume and I learn from.
Yeah.
I really respect what they're doing. I do think, though, this isn't a criticism, because they have to be everything for everyone, because they're across all different price points. It's just too much. It's really hard to be an expert in everything, which is
right.
The storyline I talk about from the auctions of the days past. You can't be an expert in absolutely everything. But Hodinkee does, I think, the best job of trying to tackle every different part of the marketplace. Do you still follow it today, and did you follow it in the early years?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah. One thing that Ben and his team have really done a great job of is making fine watches less intimidating to people. Mm-hmm. Bringing an element of fun and whimsy to the watch hobby and watch market. Swiss watch companies are by their nature very reserved. Would you say, as a former Patek Philippe?
Absolutely, yes.
Very reserved and very, serious and, let's just say very sober, solemn. Mm-hmm. But I think one thing that Ben has done a great job of is, showing how watches can be enjoyed without taking them too seriously. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about before in terms of like the thin line between educational content and entertainment, in terms of like making watches fun and making watches, less serious, if you will. So I think Hodinkee is really made a profound difference in our hobby and in our business.
It's helped make it mainstream. There's more blood than ever before.
Yeah. I think to speak to what you were saying before about you can't be everything to everybody, I think where Hodinkee was starting to maybe lose its way a little bit was in focusing on all these products that they were selling, and especially trying to, this is something I'd like to dispel a myth, if I may. Because of the entertainment nature of a lot of content that is being distributed on Instagram, on Threads, on TikTok, I believe there is a misconception on the part of people who are not dealers, where they think that being a watch dealer is just unboxing watches, making a call while you're driving in your Ferrari, having expensive dinners, traveling to fabulous locations. There is some of that, of course, but the work of being a watch dealer is actually quite, at the level you do it, it's actually very demanding and stressful and intense. And so I think that, people have to understand that being a watch dealer is not a get-rich scheme for people like you and I. It is a passion. We live, eat, and breathe watches. And, I think a lot of companies have perhaps, sort of convinced themselves, well, all I have to do is take pictures of watches and photograph them beautifully and have a nice little write-up, and I'll sell a ton of watches and make a bunch of money. But it's just not that easy, and I think you just have to have a certain level of passion to really achieve success in this business. And I think for Hodinkee, perhaps focusing too much on selling accessories and watches, I think took them a bit away from their, primary mission, which is to educate and to, create content. And so I'm glad to see that they're focusing on that again.
And with the watches of Switzerland acquisition, it seems clear, having been back at the helm, they're kind of going back to old school Hodinkee.
That's right, exactly.
And we'll see what happens, but I really believe they're going to pull it off. I mean,
I think so too.
There's a great core team over there.
Yeah.
The some of the articles that they're churning out are just incredible.
Oh, they're phenomenal.
Like, I think of what like Mark and Rich and Tony are doing today. I
Oh,
love reading this like new generation of watch journalism.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
and again, I mean, no disrespect to the journalists of the past, but it's at a much higher level
Yes.
than what we enjoyed in our youth.
Now, it's not just Hodinkee. There's this whole other subculture in WhatsApp groups today.
Sure.
And I'm in countless WhatsApp groups,
As
many
am
of
I.
them trading groups.
Yep.
It's funny because you don't even know who's on the groups sometimes.
Correct.
And then you have some people posting on multiple groups the same watch. It gets very
Right.
confusing. But I'm in one group, which we've never discussed this, which I'll tell you the name later. It's a group
Okay.
of approximately 100 top Patek Philippe collectors
Okay.
from around the world. And you can just imagine the conversation over the last few days and
Of
weeks has
course.
been
Sure.
spicy, would be an understatement.
Yeah.
A lot of opinions, and for mostly what people say on the forum stays on the forum.
Sure.
But
As it should.
strong opinions on everything,
Yes.
all things Patek Philippe. It's mostly about modern, current production. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't engage in the conversation, but I do read it.
Right.
Because I think it's so important for brands, any watch brand or any luxury brand, or frankly just any brand period, to kind of know what the people are saying.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, in your experience, on some of the chats, the forums, you see a lot of conversations of people playing armchair quarterback for the brand.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of that.
Do you dive in on that, or
Not really.
Yeah. You're a vintage guy. So
I'm a vintage, first of all. Well, here's the thing. I mean, I remember when I first started collecting watches, modern watches were a separate thing,
Mhm.
and vintage watches were a very separate thing.
Yes.
They really had not a lot to do with each other. Nowadays, because all the companies are essentially mining the DNA of their previous models,
Mhm.
whether it's the Royal Oak, whether it's the Nautilus, vintage and modern have become much more intertwined. So I think that when the modern part of the business is slower, it affects vintage. And when the vintage part of the business is slower, it affects modern. So I definitely, like you, certainly monitor, different chat groups that I'm in. I tend not to jump in so much because there are people who just have a lot of time on their hands and, want to have like hours and hours and hours of back and forth about, topics that I don't, my opinion is my opinion. I don't necessarily, have to, convince somebody else that I'm right or wrong.
And I do admit, the part that annoys me most is the social posturing, like
Yeah.
who's closer to what AD,
Right.
who's closer to Geneva,
Yeah.
and then in the photographs basically bragging about it. I just like, all right.
Well, that to me is very,
Yeah.
very declassified because the people have to remember, just from the AD perspective, and I know we're going off topic here a little bit. We're not talking about vintage, but if an AD gives you a coveted watch, and of course you know this from your years at Henry Stern Watch Agency, if an AD gives you a coveted watch, that means they're not selling it to one of their other 30, 40, 50, 100 people that want that very same watch. Okay? If you go online in any of these chat groups and you show off your new, whatever, new model, and you say, I got this from, XYZ authorized dealer, somebody will end up calling that manager at that authorized dealer and saying, I just saw so-and-so, John Reardon just got, and I thought I was in line. What's going on? I thought you said I was next. And then they have to spend how much time, smoothing over it. I don't envy the authorized dealers. They're oftentimes put in a very difficult position.
So in a nutshell, you're saying oversharing on social media or even in
Yes.
chat rooms is not a good thing.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah, I hear you.
You know what they say, loose lips sink ships.
This is so true. And I've seen a lot of relationships between collectors and the brand, Patek Philippe in this scenario. And as a result of what fellow collectors are seeing other collectors post. And that's not good for the industry.
No.
It's not good for collecting. Just so you can get your adrenaline rush that you got reference XYZ before someone else. Who cares? So.
Well, I mean, listen, people get excited. They, you know, there's a feeling of, got something that other people don't have.
Yes.
They want to show it off. But all I'm trying to say is that, as we're talking about like posting in groups and whatnot, and you could also extend that to Instagram. I just think that it's important to be mindful that when you get those kinds of watches, it is in a way a privilege, and you have to be mindful that you could create a situation for the AD you got it from.
That's true.
And hence that's why, at least for me, I tend to be very low key. So this is the only interview I've ever done in my entire 30 years of collecting.
We thank you for that.
Well, I thank you for having me. I'm very honored.
Are there any print publications that you still read today?
Speaking of Hodinkee, they were putting out a magazine that I really liked. I don't know if that's
I think they're still doing it.
They're still doing it? That was very good. They did a great job with that.
Yes.
Other than that, John, not really. How about yourself? Is there anything that you read that?
That's a good question. I didn't expect you'd 360 that one back at me.
Well,
other than auction catalogs, which I like to read them in print.
Yeah, me too.
Digital just doesn't do it for me. I find that magazines, Watch Time, I still receive. I still read whenever there's Patek Philippe content.
Oh, of course, the Patek Philippe magazine. Hello, that's what you, of course, were contributed for.
Yes.
But the Patek Philippe magazine actually is the one print publication that I still receive, look forward to, read every single word of, and really look forward to enjoying.
The watch content in the magazine is second to none, I might add.
It's unbelievable. It really is.
It's really well done.
Now you've written some great articles, Nick, and there's just been some great pieces. I even like the articles that are written by Mr. Stern. They write really interesting, articles about different models.
I've recently gone back to, because now it's been decades that the magazine's been out, and some of the early articles, you'll never see anything, I think, in the world of horological journalism that has so much research and thought. And they fact check everything, and they dive deep. And it's, in a way, since it was never shared digitally, it hasn't been digitized. The magazines have not been digitized.
Really?
So people aren't going back and reading these 20-year-old articles on the 5035 or pick the reference, and they're really, really useful information. And I'm starting to see the secondary market value of Patek magazines starting to go up.
Really? No kidding. Wow.
So insider tip, get your magazines now.
That's right.
They're on eBay. It's not easy to put together a set of all of them, but
do you remember when people used to post on eBay, used to sell literally 10 vintage Sotheby's, Christie's, Antiquorum
for a few bucks each.
For like a few bucks each.
It's great.
And now they're like, really, getting pricey.
Mm-hmm. That's true. But alas, there's still some bargains you could find on eBay if you look carefully.
True.
So what do you think in the terms of the world of content? What is the vintage watch world missing today?
In terms of content, I think that there's some really great content right now, and I would say the only thing maybe the vintage watch world is missing in terms of content is content that comes out on a more regular basis. Like, there's no such thing as like a weekly online publication that, like in entertainment, for example, we have Variety, we have The Hollywood Reporter, we have Deadline. We're, obviously a lot of that information is reviews of movies. I mean, it's not all industry information, but and a lot of it's obviously, a bit dated perhaps, but it's very useful just in terms of getting a 360 view of what's going on in entertainment. I sort of wish we had something like that in watches,
I'd love to see coverage, impartial coverage of what's happening with major dealers, with
That's what I mean, yeah.
The watch events, all the auctions from around the world. That would be absolutely fascinating.
I get all of my news from you.
Yeah, sure. It's something that I've wanted to do. It's just, it's a bandwidth.
Well, it's a huge undertaking.
Yes.
But do you know what I'm talking about? I mean, like, just as great as Hodinkee is, Hodinkee doesn't cover the industry on in real time. If we had some sort of a, whether it be an online website, whether it's a publication, whatever it would be great if there was something that actually, covered the watch business in real time, as opposed to publishing articles that are, a week and a half out of date. You know what I mean?
At the end of the day, it all comes down to asymmetry of information.
Right.
And the vintage world still knows this. It's like there's no one's going to share everything.
True.
The modern world's a bit different. The brands know they have to share everything except production numbers in some cases. But vintage is a bit different. I still think a lot of auction houses, dealers, insiders.
Do you think information is still closely held?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you think that'll change?
I think over time.
Yeah.
I think with AI, basically everything's being harvested that's ever been written. That's scary, fascinating, exciting. I don't have an opinion on it yet because I don't know enough about it. I realize AI is changing the entertainment industry overnight.
Yes, absolutely.
But do you think AI will change the collector's world?
I don't know enough about it to really know if it will or not. One thing I do know, though, is, again, going back to what I said before, watches, in spite of the digital age that we live in, in spite of the transformation of our hobby and business, watches are still an analog product. We still have to hold them, wear them, see them, wind them, and AI can't replicate that. So I don't know that AI would transform the watch business and hobby to the degree it has in other businesses, because at the end of the day, like, for example, if you're an attorney and you can use AI to write a pleading, or use it to take the place of what a paralegal might have done 5 years ago, that's transformative. But AI can't take the place of an authorized dealer in a showroom and the physical watches. So we'll see.
I think the human side of collecting, and of course the human aspect of the object itself, will never change.
That's right.
However, I do think AI, and once it's combined with blockchain, it's going to really help with authenticity.
Yes.
In a way, with vintage collecting, which will, I think, support and grow this market. It'll attract new players.
Absolutely.
Fundamentally fuel higher prices.
Well,
unfortunately.
In numismatics, they have grading.
Yes.
So they have literally companies like PCGS and NGC, and all they do is grade and authenticate coins. They have experts that sit in a room. They don't know who the coin came from or who owns it, and they assign a grade to it, and they make sure it's authentic. In our business, because we can't encapsulate watches yet, because we can't encapsulate watches the way they do with coins, we don't really have a vehicle yet where watches can be authenticated and in a way graded, if you will, because every vintage watch is different. Every watch ages differently. Every watch has been treated differently. And I do think that it would be transformative if somebody figured out the way to do that. But it's tricky. I mean, I guess right now, the closest thing we have to that are auction houses.
It's true, and it's imperfect.
And it's,
But you're right, with coins, stamps, baseball cards, comic books. There's even with sneakers, I understand, there are grading specialists. But a future guest we're going to have on the show, I don't think I've told you this yet, is Fred Savage, who's starting a new company, TGS, which is going to specialize in timepiece grading. So I can't wait to hear what he has to say on this
very interesting,
very poignant topic.
And very important.
If someone gets this right, it will change vintage collecting forever.
Well, because it'll create a comfort level for people
who are new to it.
Or new to it, yeah.
I mean, the person buying a 1518 paying seven figures,
they know what they're doing, or they have the people working for them that know what you should look at and what you should ask. But someone who might be buying their first reference 96 for $10,000, I mean, just having some sort of peace of mind with third-party opinion, I hate to use the word authentication, could bring more and new people into the collecting field. The closest thing we have really are the archive certificates, but that doesn't provide an opinion as to...
It's a copy of a birth certificate.
It's a copy of a birth certificate.
Yes.
This is what I'll say to your audience is, if you're in the market for a vintage Patek Philippe, having somebody like John is a huge resource, because John is not only an expert in all things Patek Philippe, he also understands the difference between a fair watch, a good watch, and a great watch. And I always say, when asked, like, well, what's your advice if I'm starting out? Find a great dealer like John who can really help you navigate the world of vintage timepieces, because as wonderful as it is, there are definitely pitfalls
everywhere.
And I always say that, when you have a great dealer like, John, you and collectability, you're not just buying a watch, you're buying a guarantee that what you're buying is, authentic, that it's the condition that it's been represented is correct. If something were to go wrong with the watch, it will be fixed and taken care of. Whereas when you buy watches from certain people on the internet who are upstart watch dealers, you don't get that. And you also don't get, I have to show this off because I'm so excited
I love
about it. You don't get this beautiful, look at this thing. Look at this. This is incredible. I just have to show people. Look at this. Just imagine. And then in the center is, John, you described as similar to...
Sure, in the inner slip case, it's very similar to what Patek Philippe has as their shipping box.
Yes.
We have a pocket watch box or a wristwatch box to securely ship and store.
This thing is incredible.
Patek Philippe.
And imagine if you gave this as a gift and you gift wrap this. This is impressive. You do not get this with a dealer on Instagram. Okay, sorry.
Well, with that, I think we're going to have to wrap up part one, because you said so many nice things. I'm just deeply humbled and appreciative.
And heartfelt, and, I mean every word.
Well, part one's going to end with kindness, because part two has no kindness in it, because we're going to talk about the big mistakes that we've all made in the vintage and pre-owned watch collecting world.
Where do I start?
Yes, where do I start? So as a teaser, tell us about the biggest mistake you ever made in the world of vintage collecting.
Well, John, I believe you were part of that mistake. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know. There might be a couple here. So.
Okay, well.
Which reference?
It's not a reference. It's a cushion. It's a cushion watch.
Ah, yes.
So to set the stage, going back to eBay, as we were talking about before.
I'm going to stop you right there, because that's the teaser to get people to come back to listen to part two.
Fine.
To hear the story of a certain cushion watch.
Yes.
And this story is not to be missed.
It's a tragedy, and I may start crying.
Mark, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And as we wrap up part one, I want to thank you, our listeners, for listening. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe and comment below, or ask some questions if you have any for me or for Mark, and we'll be happy to answer them. Because next time we're going to listen to common mistakes that collectors make in the watch world and collecting vintage and pre-owned watches. So that is not to be missed. Thanks again for listening. This is John Reardon for Collectability.